So my name's Simon Roberts, I'm a photographer in Brighton, and this series that you're seeing here, Pierdom, is part of a 3-year project I made documenting every single remaining pleasure pier around the coast of Britain. The series sits within my wider practice, which for the last decade has really been about recording the British landscape, exploring social, cultural and political change that has been taking place during this time. For me, the pleasure pier was interesting because in some ways it actually tracks the economic fortunes of the British coastline. The coastline was seen as somewhere quite sublime, and then through the Industrial Revolution, where these kind of great industrialists that were building the railways then built these piers which were a kind of extension into the sea, firstly for steamships, but then they also became an actual destination in themselves. And then from that we had the post-war boom where most of these piers were built. Then after the Second World War there was the decline in tourists using the British coastline. And now we're kind of seeing a slow re-emergence and some of these piers actually being seen as cultural icons. So I like the way that the pier in some ways is a metaphor for the way that we see the British coast. The piers also have an interesting link to photography. So the great Victorian photographer Francis Frith was one of the last British photographers to really make an archive of all of these piers around the coastline. And I was interested to see that actually very few works have been made since then. So I was almost kind of returning into the footsteps of Francis Frith to produce this record of the last remaining piers. I used a very similar approach to Francis Frith, using a plate camera, an old 5x4 inch camera, because I like the idea of using this Victorian style equipment to record these Victorian style structures. The camera is interesting because it's quite contemplative to use. It's a slow process. You need to think very carefully about the framing of the picture. And it also means that when you produce the print, there's very high quality of rendering in the frame. So when you look at the print on the wall as an object, there's a kind of great deal of information that is revealed. These small narratives that I like in the landscape, so it might be kind of kids playing in the distance, or it might be a particular form of architecture which you can really pick out. One of my favourite photographs, I have to say, of course, is Brighton West Pier. When you look at the picture, there's a couple in the foreground who are balancing their bottle of white wine on one of the groins while people are playing in the background. So there's a real sense of us being attached to this landscape. In the photographs, I varied the angle, the distance from the pier, the weather, the time. Sometimes I would actually use Google Street View a couple of weeks before even visiting the pier, so I could actually tour around the area working out where the best vantage points would be to take the picture. In some instances it was a case of ringing doorbells in people's apartments that overlooked the pier so that I could get a picture from their balcony. I deliberately wanted to have a sense of progression over the seasons, so we get an idea of how these particular structures have had to endure the British weather. In one instance, photographing Worthing Pier in the snow and huge kind of storm and wind, it was really quite challenging. But I wanted to get that sense of kind of power of the sea. In terms of the categorisation of a pleasure pier, I used the National Pier Society, who have actually created a catalogue identifying which is an existing pleasure pier, as also what is a lost pier. So for instance, Brighton West Pier is actually deemed a lost pier. So I decided alongside the 58 pleasure piers that still remain, I also wanted to look at some of these lost piers. So in some of the photographs you actually see an empty seascape of where a pier used to be. I wanted to capture some of the kind of faded romance and nostalgia that piers have in the British psyche, but also bring it to more contemporary look at the pier in terms of how it is linked to the community, and actually how a number of towns and cities are trying to use the pier as a way of bringing people back to the coast, almost as a needle point for us to be attracted to. I think in some ways the piers have also become part of a political debate. If we look at somewhere like Hastings, where the pier was in private ownership for long periods of time, fell into disrepair and was recently saved by a local trust and is now going to reopen. And I think that's very important to the community and important to the kind of heritage of a place. Like many, my childhood is infused with memories of trips to the seaside. After my grandparents retired to the south coast, we would often make tours of the various piers dotted along the south of England. And as part of the project, I set up a collaboration with the public where I created a website and in exhibitions around the coast of Britain where people could add their own pier story, you know, from going to their first rock concert on Hastings Pier to getting engaged on Brighton West Pier to you know, dumping their first girlfriend on Blackpool South Pier. You know, so there's just this, it's very much a kind of daily life almost happening on these places. I think it's particularly relevant to bring the work to Brighton because Brighton's history is very much tied to the pier. We had the first ever pier built, the Chain Pier, which of course was immortalised by Turner in one of his watercolours. I think people in Brighton have a very close connection to the sea and to ideas about the pier and how they very much frame our sense of place and sense of belonging. So as part of this exhibition, there's also an area where you can tell us your pier story and give us some of the anecdotes, some of the memories that you have of visiting the various piers.